All right, great. All right, welcome everyone. This is going to be a little bit of a repeat of an earlier presentation I've done, but I'll give you kind of the latest of what we've looked at. We're going to kind of go step by step and walk you through some things that I think are really going to help you cut through any issues that you have. So really what you're going to get out of this is general issues, understand the problems, general problems folks are having, adapting to the requirements. Then we're going to go more into event issues and performance card issues, and we'll end with a question and answer. For context, let's walk through the So for context, let's walk through what the rules are and kind of impact by unit type. So fossil has some things, but right now all of that is out of the way. Really, we're going to focus on wind and solar, where wind has medium impact because the performance records have been updated, and the event records are new for wind. And for solar, the event and performance records are both brand new. So solar has the highest impacts. And summary wise, 2024, you only have to report 100 megawatts and above. Starting next year, you're going to have to do 20 megawatts and above. Now, where is NERC? They said you should start collecting this data by January 1st. They didn't actually give you all the everything you needed to do that. It took a while, somewhere in between here. They gave you what the event and performance logic should be that you need to be collecting. They still hadn't given you the file formats. Then they eventually gave you the file formats, but then the IDs, they didn't tell you how to get the actual IDs if you wanted to submit. Then they finally gave you the IDs, and at this point, you should have everything you need to submit. Now, whether you're able to test with NERC or not, that's a separate thing. You have to reach out to them. We have clients that have tested, but we're not sure if there's a general system now whether you can go in without requesting to test your files, because we definitely suggest if you have a new system that you test your files somewhere. But before that, you have to make sure that you get your IDs, and then you can test the files. And once it's good, then you can submit. So by November 2024, you should have a good set of files that you can submit. So on the client side, you should have started collecting data, and really for January to August, you should have that data tested and ready. You should have all your NERC IDs ready for all your units. So by November, you can submit, January to, actually that should be September. I apologize. It should be January to September data. You should be able to submit in November. So it'll be the first 3 quarters that you should be submitting. All right, I'm going to skip through. This is about Integ. I'm going to skip through this. This is more marketing materials. We've got a ton of clients, very large clients. We do this. Power GADS is our core system. We automate solar as well as wind, and we do fully automated where we're just getting data from your Pi and SCADA system. You literally have to do nothing, except you may need to put in a cause code, and that's about it. So at the end of the day, and for systems where we can actually get the fail codes, you don't even need to put in the cause code. The system automatically gets the cause code. So this is kind of the easy button for reporting. If you have wind or solar, all we're doing is hooking up to your systems, and then we can automate a lot of this. All right. And what we're doing is proprietary machine-based learning algorithms, and we're using, tons of data from Pi and SCADA. We transform it. We get inverter or turbine level outages, and then we have our own synthesis algorithm. This is probably actually the hardest part of the system, is to go from there into the synthesis, and then we're able to automatically create the NERC events. If you need help with anything, if you're stuck, There's no cost for this. We offer these complimentary. I've had, I think, 8 utilities so far take me up on this offer. You're just going to email Sanket here and just say you want a one-on-one session, and we'll give you an hour wherever you're stuck. We can help you with that. You know, we've done it for a lot of companies, and there's been a lot of learnings that we've had. So we can help you if you need. It's complimentary. You don't need to pay for anything. You don't need to purchase software from us. All right, so let's get into the core of this. There's 4 key learnings. So with solar, summary wise, the events, this has been the biggest area, and this is very consistent for folks to create the NERC events. Initially, you have to create the inverter events to get to the NERC events, but to go from inverter events to NERC events has been tough. Same thing with performance data. It's been medium complexity. The struggles have been mostly to newness. There's, but things like POA, irradiance, folks know how to get that. But then when they needed to get expected generation and some other things, it was a little bit tougher. And some of the data items were for daylight and they were for night. So you have to capture the data in a very specific way when you're doing this. So that was part of the struggles for solar. For wind, the events were really where the struggle was. A lot of folks were already used to the wind because in the prior iteration, you had to report performance data. So it wasn't as big of a deal. You just had 1 or 2 new items and that was it. So really for wind, this was the biggest area where they struggled. Now, if you look at this, right, the biggest thing is creating NERC events from your inverter or your turbine outages. Your turbine outages, are going to look like this, but then your NERC outages can look like this, right? So there's not a one-to-one. There's no simple way to walk through this, eyeball it, to take your, inverter level data and say, hey, I can create this data. It's not simple. You will have to do the calculations digitally. You can try to do it in Excel. Just be careful. I've had a few folks, actually 3 companies, they had done it in-house. When we walked through it, a bunch of it was incorrect. So especially on the solar side, it's been worse than on the wind side. And even those 8 sessions I did, there were more problems on the solar side than the wind side, but almost all of the problems were in this conversion from the inverter or turbine outages to the NERC events. So please be very, very careful, read things thoroughly. And if you have questions, like I said, don't be, afraid to ask for that complimentary session. You don't need to purchase software. We're happy to help, the community as much as possible. So number 3, as you go through this, right? Data issues. No, we've automated all of this stuff, right? For all of the clients, but no matter what, data issues are going to persist. The reason they persist is that you really have to use Pi and SCADA, right? For this often, but at certain points, because of communications failures, right? You may get a 10-minute interval where you don't have data. For solar, it may be longer. And often it's not just the missing data, right? It's making sure what we're finding with solar that if you have certain data, then it may not be reliable. So what we've done is that we use backup points. So if this AC DC switch is fine most of the time, but in certain cases it's not good, well, I look at backup things and I look at the irradiance and I look at a bunch of other things to make sure that I can make this as solid as possible, right? If you're going to automate and really that's the only way to do this, how can you make it as solid as possible? So this will go down to making sure you have an engineer that understands the pi SCADA points and what their use is and how you're using that to tell different types of outages. And if you can get to the outage type, then often, especially so you don't know whether it's force, planned, or maintenance. We'll walk through this. In wind, you have specific codes for maintenance, but then you still don't know whether it's maintenance or planned. Here, a shortcut that we use is if you're in a place where you're submitting events to the ISO, then we look at that time frame and we use that to figure out whether it's maintenance or planned. So by default, we keep it forced, and then we look at the ISO data, and then we can do maintenance or planned if the fault codes or the other codes don't tell us whether, or operation codes don't tell us if it's maintenance or planned. Because the whole goal is that you want to automate this, and you don't want to look at it because a lot of this is all happening at an inverter level, and then you have to bring it back to the entire plant level. So you don't want to be looking at this data inverter level. It's too much work. The more you can automate, the better it's going to be. Again, missing data. What is your strategy to fill in data, and how are you going to do this, right? So, yeah, like Adam said, if you guys have any questions, please let us know. Submit the questions in Q&A. But if you're missing data, right, there's a couple of strategies that you can do. And really, all of them involve looking at to say, look, if you were on and you missed 2 intervals and you're still on in the 3rd interval, then you can safely assume that you were on. But when in those 2 intervals, if you have maybe generation or something else to back it up, use that. Typically, when you're doing the automation, if you're missing 1 10-minute, there's nothing you can do, right? If in your auditing, if NERC comes back and says, hey, why did this happen? If you have a consistent strategy and you've documented what you're using, they're going to be fine. So just have a strategy that is defensible and use that strategy consistently for missing data. If you have large chunks missing, what we do is we create information only events and say, hey, there was a comms failure or something. Then a human has to look into it and try to fill it in. And what gap constitutes that, each company can have their own, kind of comfort level. Certain companies are going to say, hey, listen, if there's more than an hour missing, then document it and we'll figure it out. And then we have the ability for them to add in manual inverter or turbine outages as well in the system. So keep that in mind. Also, one thing that I want to show you, let me get to this. Is that when you're looking at this, right, you're going to have tons of turbine events, right? And you want the ability to create your own, right? And within here, let users, because if you miss data, they're going to have to create this. The other thing is that the cause codes should come in automatically as much as possible. This client doesn't have that because they're not giving us the fault codes, but where possible, if you give us the cause codes, we can translate those into the NERC codes. It's part of the algorithm, but internally you can do the same thing. But whatever you do, make sure that you have the ability for clients to update these turbine events and as needed, so that, or create new ones so that they can do what's needed. Last thing I'll talk about is the chatter. We see this sporadically in clients. I am pretty much 99% sure you're going to encounter this. This is where you see a unit go on and off every few seconds. The way to do this is to, similar to the missing data, is to find where it starts. And to do that, what you're going to say is, I'm going to pick a duration to say, okay, look, if it goes on and off within seconds, more than 2 times, then that's chatter. And then what we do is we go back to the first time it started, and we assume that's the, the value before that was the right state, and then we ignore it until we see it stop coming. But when you're doing automation, this actually seems minor, but it takes a lot of work to actually create the logic to do this. But if you don't do this, then it's going to be kind of, garbage in, garbage out. So you will have to do this to make sure you have quality data before you can run your algorithms to create everything. Otherwise, they are not going to be correct. And what folks are starting to do is they're using this data for performance and other thing as well. So you just want this to be good quality data that, again, is defensible in a NERC audit, so you don't have problems. All right, and then number 4, again, this is kind of a soft issue, right? Is that the folks that are doing this, I see, and this isn't half the clients, folks are coming from fossil, or folks that are doing it are from fossil are taking over, and they're not used to, renewables resources. They're not used to how much data there is. They're not used to actually a world where the data is missing or it's not as reliable, because with the fossil units, they've had a long time to get things checked, and you didn't have the same type of, high level, high volume data. So it's a big challenge. And for some people, just understanding how these work, just because they came from fossil and now they're put in charge of this, doesn't mean that they truly understand it. There's learning experiences for those folks as well. So testing becomes a challenge because they haven't been used to it. And what I'm recommending always is have that engineer that understands the Pi and SCADA tags, because they will be your best friend when you're doing this testing. If you don't have that capability and you're trying to do some of this without that, it's really not going to be possible, or I don't think you can do it well without that. So keep that in mind. Really what we're seeing is a couple options. The same fossil groups are reporting for renewables, and this is often people have the toughest time. When there's an existing or new renewables group reporting, this actually works out better. Also, they don't have the minutia of reporting to NERC and all of that yet. That part takes learning, but they're able to actually do and come up with the calcs and do everything as well. And then the best is generally, if any of these groups have that engineer with that SCADA is required, and at least short term, it really helps. And especially for this fossil groups that's reporting renewables, this I don't think they can do it without this, specific engineer. So yeah, again, testing has been challenging. The client groups themselves don't have enough time. NERC event logic is new for all of the groups. For if you're in a renewables group, GADS is kind of new often. If you didn't have the old wind, even if you had the old wind stuff, it's a little bit different. Data issues, right, are complicating everything. And there's no parallel systems that exist, right, to kind of, that's a touchstone to say, hey, is this right or is this wrong? So just keep that in mind. Testing has been challenging for everyone. All right. So, and last thing, there's a lot of, the NERC DRI has a lot of metrics and everything. What I'm going to say is, for now, just ignore those. You have to make sure you can get the data to NERC. Most companies don't know what to do with those metrics. Now, for us personally, we've built all those metrics. We have ad hoc reporting, But what we're doing also is that NERC's way of reporting, it's almost like you're taking that first 20 megawatts and you have these odd rules. So we're doing two sets of books. We're doing reporting based on the full inverter or turbine level outages, and then we're doing it for NERC. And clients are finding the actual inverter or other one a lot more helpful. But when I talk about this reporting, this is not the report you're submitting to NERC for your events and performance. This is the metrics and the NERC DRI that I'm discussing. And, those metrics are, they're just, to me right now, they're providing limited insight, but you should still have something so that your executives, or if somebody asks for it, you'll be able to provide it. So like I said, we've done all of this, but we're finding that when you're actually doing the granular level events, it's a lot more useful for performance and actual practical reasons. And what we're also finding is that a ton of graphical views are needed, and along with the reporting, whereas before you could have E4D and this and that. Here, to understand the numbers, it's really nice to get graphical views. So all right, now let's get into the events and some of the things we can help you with. All right. And why events are not easy. I want folks to keep this in mind. Event changes over time and they can be ongoing from month to month. So if I hear when I'm trying to do the NERC event, right? We actually do this. So here, I don't have an ending. So if I don't have an ending, I can't graph the event because I don't know how tall it needs to be. For now, I know that it started here. I don't know where it ended. And this is with simulated data, but I have a client that has this exact thing where for the entire period, they've had turbines out and they haven't gotten back to 95%. So this event keeps going and going and going. But imagine this event ended in, let's say, March, right? Or ended in April, right? Um, if it ends in April, if and something changed in January, well, it could change this event. So you have to be really, really careful that when you're doing this, you have to do it moving forward. And if you ever change anything historically within the year, you have to see what the effects are going forward. And in fact, for us, this was the most complicated part, is when you change a historical, we have to move forward and recalculate everything going forward because of the nature of this. So just don't minimize this, especially if you have stuff going all over the place. You could see here, there's tons of stuff going on, but if you have a couple turbines always out, once you hit that 20 megawatts, like which is here, you are going to have, problems getting the event ended. So just be very careful with that. That's the number one thing, is you have to know that changing historical data can have huge impacts for future events. That stops at the end of the year, but from January to December, you have to worry. So in December, you don't really have to worry if there's changes because it's the last month, but anything prior to December, you do have to worry that it can change future months. So again, I want to keep stressing this more than anything. This is one of the biggest problems that I see. All right, number one, I brought this up again, is that you see all of these inverter outages, but see here, these are all inverter outages, and you see here, these are all turbine outages. But then the event, well, this event isn't even formed, but there's no one-to-one, right? You have tons of these things, and here, in fact, it's not even starting. So going from inverter or turbine outages to the NERC events is very complex. There's no simple way to do this without detailed calculations. And even folks that have done this in-house, they were all incorrect. Once I reviewed it, I was able to help them fix it. one of them fixed it. The other ones just ended up, moving to just buying systems because they didn't want to deal with it. But this is really critical. And with some of the upcoming changes likely that will happen, it'll get even more complicated. And you have to throw in the fact that your Pi or SCADA data may not be correct. So remember, this inverter or turbine level events have to be correct. You have to allow for problems and people to fix those events. If you don't have data, or if you have bad data, either automatically fix it or let people have some manual stuff, right? And then these things will create the NERC events, right? So these will, and this is inverters, you don't see it as bad as the turbines, but these will create these NERC events. So these have to be really, really correct. And your algorithm to go from here to here has to be correct. And this is a super, super complex algorithm. It's not simple. So just keep in mind, it can be simple depending on what happens. If you just have a couple things out, can be simple, but it can also be very, very complex based on what's happening. And I'd say 80% of the time it's on the complex side. So you may get lucky a month or two, but then over time, when you hit those complex scenarios, that logic for moving from here to the NERC events will fail if you haven't done it properly. And I have yet to see somebody doing it in-house that's done this properly. So just check this as much as possible. Again, we start with Pi SCADA data. You're going to want the generation. You're going to want, different breaker statuses, switches, AC/DC switches. For the wind, you're going to want the different fault codes, operation codes, and you're going to use those to figure out, each gap, whether you're generating, whether you're en route, or et cetera, for wind. And here you're going to have to figure out each few minutes what's going on. And remember, with solar, you also have to keep track of when there's between, sunrise to sunset, that period versus the night period. You have to account for hours differently. Really, the suggestion is that, create everything at the inverter or turbine level, get your outages. Now, remember, these outages are full outages. If you have an inverter partially out, NERC doesn't care. Throw that out for this point. You don't care. If the inverter is out, if it cannot produce, not because of lack of sun or irradiance, or not because of low wind or high wind or anything like that. If it can't produce because it's not functioning, or you're in a planned or maintenance, then you are going to count that. Now, when you do all of this, the yellow is the planned or maintenance. You don't care about that. Once you get 20 megawatts below the total outages, that's when everything's going to start. Second thing is you're going to have to determine whether you're going to require cause codes for each individual, or you're just going to aggregate, right? So for our purposes, when we're reporting, we're just going to do the aggregate sum of everything, but we still get individual inverter level fault codes, and then we sum those up. Again, keep in mind that everything starts at a 20 megawatt loss, and this ignores planned maintenance losses. Okay, this should be a forced loss, and you're going to keep going. This is what I said. This can keep going for months. You have to find, when you do this, the low point. So in theory, if this keeps going, you can't actually do this till December. You can't actually figure out where it's going to end until December. And I showed you this case, right? I'm in January. I started in January. It's September now. I don't know when this is ending because these things keep going, right? And I may have different nadirs as I go, or low points as I go. And the point I want to make is if it looks like this and I ended here, right? Here it ends at 98.75, but then if I have a different low here, then it actually ended at 98.5, right? If I went from 20 to 30 instead. So as the event happens, if different events go lower, then it can actually change it. So you have to be very careful. Now, if it didn't go lower, then you know that the event's going to end at 98.75, and as soon as you get to that, you're good. Just also remember though, while you started at 20 megawatts below, you know, which is 80, when you get back, it doesn't end when you get back to 80. It's not ending here. It's 95% of the low. So it's starting here, but it's actually ending here. You can see from this green. And, I've had a bunch of people actually mess this up as well. But, that's an easier one to get past. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Nadir shifts, and that means you hit a new low that is going to shift and cause a recalculation. And everything goes from all the way until December. After December, you don't care. January 1st, everything resets. So make sure you account for that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about cost codes. All right. If you don't have software, find the largest inverter loss event and just use the cost code for that. I mean, there's multiple other ways you can do it, but this is what I tell clients, just find the biggest loss and use the cost code for that. Now, if you're using the software, what we do is we utilize the fault codes and map to the NERC cost codes. This may be several hundred lines, but it's just a one time. And then what we do is we sum by that NERC cause code after we've done the translation, and we pick the one with the biggest cause code that had the largest loss megawatt, and then we assign that cost code. So for our purposes, when we have the fault codes or other codes then, or the OEM codes, then users don't even need to put in the NERC cost code. So it becomes fully automated at that time, which is really nice. All right, so to summarize, creating NERC events is not easy. The event changes over time to time, can be ongoing from month to month, and changing historical data in the past can really impact your future months. So keep those things in mind. For the event types, default to forced, and then depending on what your system gives you, you may or may not be able to tell. And most folks are just not able to tell whether it's a PO or an MO. So by default, they're making it MOs, but then they can change it to POs later. Or what we're saying, where you have the ISO data in real time, you can use that data to actually come up with what was going on, whether it was planned or maintenance, because you have to submit that to the ISO. So if you're in, SPP, PJM, KISO, New England ISO, all of those types of places, ISO or RTOs, then you're going to have to submit your real-time outages and future outages, and that will already be there by the time you're doing this, so you can use that for these purposes. And same thing, you need to allow for turbine inverter level outages, and that's to say, look, if something was wrong here, or if you had one turbine not communicating for half the month, first of all, you have to show that as an IO event so users can modify it, right? We have event type. So you have to show that if you're building a system, and then you have to let users modify it to say whether it was forced or just delete it and say, you know what, it was actually operating fine. It just didn't communicate. Whatever it is, just make sure you allow that, because if you don't allow that, that is going to be a huge, huge problem. All right, next thing, make sure that you use the NREL data and the spreadsheets to bring in your sunrise and sunset times. These are going to be important. You're going to use these with your AC, DC switches, inverter generation, irradiance, number of inverters available, recloser information, plant generation, etc. So you can use inverter level, plant level, plus this data to pretty much figure out all of the things you need for your solar performance. So these are going to be very, very critical for that. So, all right. So yeah. Hey, Mark, thanks for the comment. All right. So again, if you need help, again, this is all complimentary. You don't need to buy software or anything. If you're stuck on specific areas, we can work with you. And then finally, I'm going to end with the learnings from the performance. These were the three metrics that took more time, and I'll kind of walk through this, right? Your status generally is going to be active. The gross net is generally very easy to get. Um, Remember, this net, though, typically you're going to get this at the station POI level, where this is going to be an aggregation of your inverters and the sum of it. And again, it's often called net generation when you get it at the inverter or turbine level. But for NERC purposes, that's what you're putting in the gross. And this is going to be at the at the plant level, and this is often in a different place when you're getting it. The net max capacity, this is going to be static. This typically is very standard. Performance ratios, almost everybody has had to calculate this. Expected generation, almost everybody has had to calculate this. Before NERC, there was a value, but that value that almost everybody has is not the correct value. So you have to look at the actual DRI and what they're asking for, because often it's the wrong expected generation. Please, this is like a weather adjusted based on the model. It's not kind of using historical or anything. So just double check this. It's it's really critical. Now the active in solar and inverter hours, this is going to involve your different day and nighttime hours. The inactive, for now, generally we're skipping. Most people don't have an active mothball or retired, but if you do, that should be easy. The service hours is, basically when you're running. The reserve shutdown. For most folks, this is going to be the last thing that's left, and I'll talk about this, but this is not easy to get. And what we're doing with most folks is getting everything else, and this is kind of the leftover that gets calculated. Again, these forced maintenance inverters, some folks just initially have everything put into forced, and then they later figure out what's maintenance or planned, or sometimes they just have it forced and a planned and they're not sure and they just throw it in one bucket. So again, for this is where I was saying use the ISO data that can help you. Resource unavailable hours. Again, this gets a little tricky because you have to look at the sunrise, sunset, and your resource unavailable. You have to put it into day and night. And then you have the service inverters for the night, as well as your forced maintenance and plan for the night. And this gets tricky. A lot of folks, when they're doing their work, they're only looking at the outages when there's kind of daylight out, and they're looking at the irradiance, but that's actually incorrect. You will have to look at what's going on at night. And especially if you had something that started, and well, at night it doesn't matter, right? Because there's no sun, but you have to actually continue that outage. So keep that in mind. Like, you can't just use daylight hours to look at a lot of this. If something happened at night, you have to be able to tell. And then you have the resource unavailable hours in the night as well. So again, we end up just using the calc. So all right, so for wind, really everything was fairly simple because most folks had dealt with it. If you haven't, this is going to be a little bit new, but you're usually able to get these. And again, this expected generation was new for most folks because it's a little different from what's been traditionally done. So check this for wind as well. Pretty much everyone that's done right now was not what NERC was asking for, so you have to do this calc, but it should be done, and it'll typically come from PyroSCADA. And then again, reserve shutdown ends up being a calc. Most folks don't have this correctly, or they don't know how to measure this that well. But what you can say is you get everything else, and then whatever is left over, you just throw into this bucket, because that's the best way to do this. So yeah, like I said, reserve shutdowns derive from any of the missing hours that are left from the period hours, and you should be able to fill everything in. Also, we're finding that depending on the manufacturer of the turbine, that Ruth hours, it's tricky. You have to make sure you get all of the different cause codes and, whether it's the cables are winding, unwinding, all of that type of stuff. A lot of that is going to fall into Ruth. So if you work with an engineer, then you're going to be able to do this properly. That's kind of my suggestion for this. And just initially, this expected gen and solar performance ratio, these took a little bit longer. So just, I think by now, hopefully everybody should have had this and you've worked with your folks from engineering to make sure they're getting you this data. So yeah, I'll kind of end this with just saying, if you have any questions, reach out to Sankit or reach out to this email as well. Or you can contact us on LinkedIn, Amit Patel. You can find mine at Integ, or you can find Sankit at Integ, or Aiden at Integ. And then, if there's any questions here, I can take them as well. Just let me know. I don't see anything in the Q&A. But if anybody else has any questions, just let me know. I can take them right now.